In the early 1950s, as the Soviet Union expanded its influence across newly independent and ideologically aligned states, a recurring pattern began to emerge that was rarely acknowledged publicly, but was well understood inside Moscow's military and political leadership, which was that Soviet military advisors deployed to client states were not intended merely to train, observe, or offer technical guidance, but to shape operational decisions directly, often functioning as de facto commanders embedded within foreign armed forces whose formal sovereignty masked a far deeper level of external control. This system did not arise from a single doctrine or named operation, but from practical necessity, because the Soviet leadership recognized that supplying weapons, training, and political support was insufficient to guarantee outcomes on the ground if local militaries lacked experience in modern warfare, discipline under pressure, or alignment with Soviet strategic priorities, and advisors therefore became instruments of control rather than passive consultants. These advisory missions expanded rapidly as decolonization accelerated, particularly in Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Eastern Europe and the broader socialist periphery, where new regimes sought military assistance but lacked coherent command structures, creating environments in which Soviet officers could exert influence disproportionate to their formal role. Advisors were officially framed as technical specialists attached to ministries of defense, general staffs, or combat units. Yet in practice, they often controlled planning processes, approved operational concepts, and mediated disputes between local commanders, effectively inserting Soviet judgment into the heart of client state decision-making without formal assumption of command responsibility. This arrangement offered Moscow a powerful form of power projection because it allowed the Soviet Union to influence wars and internal security operations while avoiding the political and diplomatic costs of overt intervention, maintaining plausible deniability even as Soviet doctrine, planning methods, and strategic priorities shaped outcomes. The effectiveness of this system rested on asymmetry, as client states depended heavily on Soviet weapons, logistics, and training, giving advisors leverage that extended far beyond their nominal advisory remit, particularly when spare parts, ammunition, or technical expertise could be withheld or delayed to enforce compliance. Soviet advisors were typically drawn from experienced officer cadres with backgrounds in large-scale operations, staff planning, and combined arms doctrine, and they arrived with detailed guidance on how to steer local forces towards Soviet-preferred approaches without provoking resistance or undermining the legitimacy of local leadership. Language barriers, cultural differences, and political sensitivities complicated this task, but these challenges were mitigated by embedding advisors deeply within command structures rather than confining them to training roles, allowing influence to be exerted through daily interaction rather than formal orders. Intelligence reporting from this period indicates that advisors frequently drafted operational plans, prepared briefing materials, and shaped rules of engagement that local commanders then formally approved, creating a paper trail that preserved the appearance of national decision-making while ensuring alignment with Soviet objectives. This approach proved particularly valuable in environments where client militaries were fragmented, politicized, or inexperienced, as advisors could act as arbiters between competing factions, reinforcing central authority while advancing Soviet interests. The system also allowed Moscow to calibrate its level of involvement, increasing advisor influence during critical phases while reducing visibility during politically sensitive moments, maintaining flexibility that direct command would have foreclosed. Unlike overt intervention, advisory control did not require large troop deployments or permanent basing, reducing logistical burden and limiting exposure to escalation. Yet, it still enabled Soviet doctrine to be applied on the battlefield through proxy forces. This method of influence was reinforced by the structure of Soviet military assistance itself, as equipment deliveries, training pipelines, and doctrinal materials were tightly integrated, ensuring that local forces operated within a framework that advisors understood intimately and could manipulate effectively. Advisors thus functioned as both instructors and supervisors, translating Soviet strategic intent into operational reality while preserving the fiction of local autonomy. Western intelligence assessments during the 1950s and early 1960s gradually recognized this pattern, noting that Soviet advisors often exercised authority inconsistent with their declared role. Yet, attribution remained difficult because formal command remained nominally national, and Soviet involvement could be denied or minimized diplomatically. This ambiguity served Soviet interests well, as it allowed Moscow to shape conflicts indirectly while avoiding commitments that might trigger alliance responses or international condemnation. The use of advisors as de facto commanders therefore emerged not as an aberration, but as a systematic instrument of Soviet foreign policy, one that blended military expertise, political leverage, and organizational control into a flexible mechanism for influencing outcomes across multiple regions. By the early 1960s, this model had become institutionalized within Soviet military planning, with advisory missions treated as integral components of power projection rather than auxiliary support, setting the stage for decades of indirect control over client-state militaries conducted through guidance, presence, and embedded authority rather than formal command. As the 1960s advanced, the Soviet advisory system evolved from an improvised solution into a standardized instrument of influence, as Moscow refined how advisors were selected, deployed, and embedded within client-state militaries to maximize control while minimizing visibility. And this refinement reflected a growing confidence that indirect command could achieve strategic outcomes without the risks associated with overt intervention. Advisory missions were increasingly tailored to the political reliability and military competence of the host regime, with larger and more intrusive advisory presences assigned to states where leadership cohesion was weak or where military operations carried significant regional implications, while smaller, more technical missions were used where local command structures were stable and aligned. This differentiation allowed the Soviet Union to calibrate influence precisely, expanding control where necessary, and maintaining distance where political optics demanded restraint. Advisors were no longer confined to training academies or rear area staff roles, but were routinely placed within operational headquarters, planning cells, and even forward units, ensuring that Soviet doctrine shaped decisions at every level of command without requiring Soviet officers to issue orders in their own name. This placement enabled advisors to influence force deployment, timing of offensives, and allocation of resources, effectively guiding campaigns through consultation that carried implicit authority because it was backed by control over material support. Client-state commanders understood that ignoring advisor guidance could jeopardize access to weapons, spare parts, or technical assistance, creating a system of compliance enforced through dependency rather than coercion. Soviet advisors also functioned as conduits for intelligence, reporting directly to Moscow on the political reliability of local officers, the performance of units, and the internal dynamics of host militaries, allowing the Soviet leadership to adjust both military support and political strategy in response to conditions on the ground. This intelligence role reinforced advisor authority. as local commanders were aware that their decisions and behavior were being monitored and evaluated by an external patron whose support was essential to regime survival. Doctrinal influence was exerted through standardized planning templates, operational manuals, and staff procedures introduced by advisors, gradually reshaping client militaries to mirror Soviet organizational models, which further increased advisor leverage by creating systems only Soviet-trained personnel fully understood. Language barriers and cultural resistance did not disappear, but advisors mitigated them by cultivating relationships with key officers, offering career advancement opportunities through training in the Soviet Union, and positioning themselves as indispensable intermediaries between local forces and the flow of external support. Western intelligence assessments during this period increasingly noted that Soviet advisors often possessed veto power over major operations, even if that power was exercised informally, and that client state commanders frequently deferred to advisor judgment in moments of uncertainty, effectively ceding operational control while retaining formal authority. This arrangement allowed Moscow to shape conflicts in ways that aligned with broader strategic goals, such as avoiding escalation with Western powers or managing regional balances, even when local leaders favored more aggressive action. The advisory system thus functioned as a brake as well as an accelerator, enabling the Soviet Union to restrain client behavior when necessary without the political cost of public intervention. The use of advisors also reduced the need for large-scale Soviet deployments, conserving resources and limiting exposure, while still projecting power. Through proxy forces, an advantage that became increasingly important as the Soviet Union managed commitments across multiple theaters. By the late 1960s, advisory missions had become a routine feature of Soviet foreign policy, supported by institutional frameworks that standardized training, reporting, and command relationships, ensuring consistency across diverse regions. This institutionalization marked a shift from ad hoc influence to sustained control, embedding Soviet military judgment within the command structures of client states in a way that was durable, scalable, and difficult for external observers to counter. The result was a form of power projection that operated through presence rather than occupation, enabling Moscow to influence wars and internal security operations while maintaining the legal and political fiction of local sovereignty, a fiction that proved resilient precisely because it was grounded in formal structures, even as real authority flowed through Soviet hands. By the early 1970s, the Soviet system of military advisors acting as de facto commanders had reached a level of sophistication that allowed Moscow to manage multiple client states simultaneously without assuming formal responsibility for their wars. And this capability reshaped how the Soviet Union projected power beyond its borders, because influence could now be exercised through guidance, constraint, and selective intervention rather than through direct command or occupation. Advisors during this period were increasingly integrated into national general staffs, defense ministries, and operational planning directorates, positioning them at points where strategic intent was translated into executable plans. And this placement ensured that Soviet priorities shaped outcomes long before combat units moved. The distinction between advice and authority became largely semantic, as advisors drafted operational concepts, evaluated force readiness, and set conditions for action that local commanders were expected to follow if they wished to retain Soviet support. This expectation was reinforced by the structure of military assistance agreements, which tied continued delivery of weapons, ammunition, and technical support to compliance with advisor guidance, creating a feedback loop in which operational dependence translated directly into political and military control. Soviet advisors also played a critical role in shaping rules of engagement and escalation management, particularly in regions where conflict risked drawing in Western powers, and intelligence reporting indicates that advisors frequently moderated local commanders' impulses toward rapid escalation, aligning battlefield behavior with Moscow's broader strategic calculations. This restraint function was as important as offensive guidance, because it allowed the Soviet Union to influence conflicts while managing the risk of superpower confrontation, preserving strategic flexibility that direct intervention would have constrained. Advisory control extended beyond battlefield decisions into force structure and training, as advisors oversaw reorganization of units, introduction of Soviet-style command hierarchies, and adoption of standardized planning cycles, gradually aligning client militaries with Soviet operational culture. This alignment increased the effectiveness of advisor influence because local officers trained within Soviet frameworks were more receptive to guidance and less likely to challenge assumptions embedded in doctrine. The system also created long-term dependency, as maintenance of complex Soviet equipment required continued access to Soviet technicians and expertise, ensuring that advisor presence remained necessary even in periods of reduced combat activity. Western intelligence assessments during this period increasingly described Soviet advisory missions as shadow command structures, noting that key decisions were often vetted by advisors before implementation, yet public attribution remained difficult because formal authority remained national, and advisors rarely appeared in visible leadership roles. This ambiguity protected Moscow from diplomatic repercussions while allowing effective control over client behavior. The advisory system proved adaptable across diverse political environments, functioning in centralized regimes, revolutionary governments, and fragile coalitions alike, because its leverage derived from material dependence and institutional embedding rather than ideological alignment alone. Soviet planners viewed this adaptability as a strategic asset, enabling influence to be exerted even when local political conditions were unstable or contested. By the mid-1970s, advisory missions had become integral to Soviet crisis management, providing channels through which Moscow could receive real-time information, issue guidance, and adjust support levels without deploying its own forces. This capability allowed the Soviet Union to shape outcomes indirectly while maintaining plausible deniability, a balance that proved particularly valuable in regions where overt intervention would have triggered international response. The cumulative effect of these practices was the creation of a distributed command presence in which Soviet military judgment permeated multiple foreign armed forces simultaneously, extending Moscow's reach without the burdens of formal empire. This phase demonstrated that advisors were not peripheral actors, but central instruments of Soviet strategy, enabling a form of control that was flexible, scalable, and politically insulated. And by the late 1970s, the use of advisors as de facto commanders had become a defining feature of Soviet power projection, shaping conflicts through embedded authority rather than visible force. As the late 1970s transitioned into the early 1980s, the Soviet advisory model faced pressures that tested its effectiveness and exposed its internal contradictions, because the very mechanisms that enabled advisors to function as de facto commanders also created friction with client state sovereignty, military professionalism, and political legitimacy. And managing these tensions became a central task of Soviet foreign and military policy. Advisors increasingly found themselves balancing two competing imperatives, which were to exert sufficient influence to ensure alignment with Soviet strategic objectives, while avoiding the appearance of foreign domination that could undermine the host regime's authority or provoke nationalist backlash within the armed forces. This balance required careful management of visibility, as advisors continued to shape operational outcomes, but were encouraged to do so through consultation, consensus building, and indirect control rather than overt direction, reinforcing the fiction that decisions remained locally generated even when they reflected Soviet preferences. The expansion of advisory, influence into sensitive areas such as internal security, counterinsurgency, and regime protection heightened these challenges, because these domains touch directly on political power rather than external defense, increasing the risk that advisors would be perceived as instruments of external control rather than partners. Soviet internal assessments from this period acknowledged that excessive advisor dominance could weaken client-state command authority by eroding the confidence and initiative of local officers, creating forces that were technically capable but strategically dependent. And this recognition prompted efforts to recalibrate advisory roles, to preserve the appearance of national command even as influence remained substantial. Training and doctrinal guidance were adjusted to emphasize the development of local leadership within Soviet frameworks, aiming to create officers who could execute Soviet-style operations autonomously while remaining aligned with Moscow's expectations, reducing the need for constant advisor intervention. Nevertheless, dependency persisted because complex weapon systems, logistics chains, and maintenance regimes continued to require Soviet expertise, ensuring that advisors retained leverage even when formal influence was moderated. Advisory missions also became more politically complex as client states diversified their external relationships, occasionally seeking support from multiple patrons to reduce dependence, forcing Soviet advisors to operate in environments where influence could no longer be taken for granted and had to be actively maintained through performance, reliability, and responsiveness. Western intelligence reporting from this period noted instances where advisors faced resistance from local commanders who resented external oversight. Yet these tensions rarely resulted in decisive rupture because the structural dependence embedded in military assistance agreements limited the ability of client states to disengage without jeopardizing their security. Soviet planners responded to these dynamics by refining reporting and oversight mechanisms, ensuring that advisor feedback informed not only military planning, but political assessments of regime stability and loyalty, allowing Moscow to adjust support in ways that reinforced compliance without overt coercion. The advisory system thus functioned as both a military and political instrument, enabling the Soviet Union to shape not only battlefield behavior, but internal power balances within client states. This dual role increased the strategic value of advisors, but also heightened the risk of entanglement, as deeper involvement in internal affairs exposed Moscow to the consequences of local political failure or instability. To manage this risk, Soviet leadership increasingly emphasized deniability and modular engagement, structuring advisory missions so that influence could be scaled up or down without formal escalation, preserving flexibility in response to changing conditions. Advisors were instructed to document their involvement carefully, maintaining formal records that emphasized advisory functions while minimizing evidence of direct command, a practice designed to protect both Moscow and host governments from accusations of external control. This attention to documentation and procedure underscored the importance of legality and optics in sustaining the advisory model, as plausible deniability remained essential to its political viability. As technological change accelerated, particularly in communications and surveillance, advisors also had to adapt to environments where their presence and influence were more visible to external observers, increasing the importance of coordination with diplomatic channels to manage international perception. Despite these challenges, the core logic of the advisory system remained intact, as it continued to offer a means of influencing conflicts without committing large, Soviet forces or assuming formal responsibility for outcomes, a trade-off that remained attractive in an era of constrained resources and heightened superpower tension. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet use of military advisors as de facto commanders had evolved into a mature but increasingly complex instrument of power, one that required constant adjustment to balance control, legitimacy, and deniability. This phase revealed the limits of indirect command, showing that while advisors could shape decisions and outcomes, they could not fully substitute for local political cohesion or eliminate the risk of backlash inherent in external influence. Nevertheless, the persistence of the advisory model demonstrated its strategic utility as Moscow continued to rely on embedded authority to project power across multiple regions without crossing thresholds that would trigger direct confrontation. The experience of this period underscored that the effectiveness of advisors lay not in formal command, authority, but in their ability to operate within institutional structures, dependencies, and political constraints that allowed influence to be exerted quietly and continuously, sustaining Soviet involvement in client-state conflicts while preserving the outward appearance of national sovereignty. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet system of using military advisors as de facto commanders had become deeply embedded in how Moscow managed its relationships with client states. Yet this maturity coincided with mounting structural strain as economic pressure, technological competition, and political uncertainty increasingly constrained the resources and authority that sustained advisory influence. Advisors continued to occupy critical positions within client-state command structures, but their ability to enforce compliance relied more heavily on persuasion, performance, and selective leverage than on the automatic authority that had characterized earlier phases, reflecting a gradual shift from dominance to management. This shift was driven in part by the growing complexity of client militaries, which had accumulated experience, developed indigenous officer corps, and in some cases cultivated alternative external relationships, reducing the asymmetry on which advisor authority had originally depended. Soviet planners recognized that the advisory model functioned best where dependence remained high and political alignment clear, and internal assessments increasingly differentiated between environments where advisors could effectively shape decisions and those where influence would be contested or diluted. Nevertheless, advisors remained central to crisis management, as their embedded presence allowed Moscow to receive granular reporting, shape operational tempo, and intervene indirectly to restrain or redirect client actions that risked escalation beyond acceptable limits. This capability was particularly valued as superpower competition intensified rhetorically, while resources tightened materially, making indirect influence more attractive than overt deployment. Advisors also played a stabilizing role within client militaries by mediating disputes, reinforcing centralized command, and discouraging unauthorized action, functions that extended beyond battlefield guidance into the preservation of regime control. This internal role increased advisor exposure to domestic political dynamics, blurring the boundary between military assistance and political intervention. Yet Moscow judged the risk acceptable because it preserved influence without formal responsibility. Western intelligence assessments during this period increasingly characterized Soviet advisory missions as instruments of political management as much as military support, noting that advisors were often more involved in maintaining cohesion and discipline than in directing combat operations. This observation reflected the evolution of the advisory system from a tool for shaping external conflict to a mechanism for sustaining client regimes under pressure. Technological change further influenced advisor roles as improved communications enabled more frequent contact with Moscow, reducing the need for autonomous decision-making by advisors while increasing central oversight. Yet this connectivity also heightened vulnerability to surveillance and attribution, reinforcing the importance of discretion and procedural caution. Advisors adapted by formalizing consultation processes and maintaining careful documentation that preserved the advisory fiction even as influence remained substantial. Despite these adaptations, the system faced inherent limits, as advisors could not fully compensate for declining local legitimacy, economic weakness, or political fragmentation within client states. And Soviet leadership increasingly recognized that advisory control could shape but not resolve underlying structural problems. This recognition did not lead to abandonment of the model, but to more selective application, as Moscow concentrated advisory resources where returns were highest and disengaged incrementally from environments where influence had become costly or ineffective. By the late 1980s, the use of military advisors as de facto commanders had become one component of a broader strategy focused on risk management rather than expansion, reflecting a recalibration of Soviet power projection in response to systemic constraint. Advisors remained influential, but their role was increasingly defensive, aimed at preventing loss of position rather than achieving decisive gains. This transition marked a subtle but significant shift in the function of advisory missions, from instruments of confident expansion to tools for managing decline without overt retreat. The persistence of the advisory system through this period nevertheless demonstrated its adaptability, as it continued to provide Moscow with leverage, information, and influence, even as external conditions deteriorated. The experience underscored that the strength of the advisory model lay not in its ability to command directly, but in its capacity to embed influence within institutions, dependencies, and procedures that could endure beyond the presence of Soviet personnel themselves. As the Cold War approached its final phase, Soviet advisors remained active across multiple regions, shaping outcomes quietly and incrementally, embodying a form of power projection that was deliberately indirect, politically insulated, and sustained through embedded authority rather than visible control. As the late 1980s approached their conclusion, the Soviet use of military advisors as de facto commanders increasingly revealed the long-term strategic logic and limitations of indirect control. Because the advisory system had succeeded in projecting influence without formal occupation, yet it had also bound Soviet power to the stability, competence, and legitimacy of regimes over which Moscow exercised only partial authority. Advisors continued to operate within client-state command structures, shaping planning, training, and operational conduct. But their effectiveness was now constrained by factors that lay beyond military technique, including economic strain, political fragmentation, and declining ideological cohesion, conditions that reduced the leverage advisors could exert through material dependency alone. Soviet leadership increasingly recognized that advisors could guide decisions and restrain escalation, but could not manufacture political will or resolve structural weaknesses within client regimes, a realization that reframed advisory missions from tools of expansion to mechanisms of containment. This shift altered how advisors were evaluated and deployed, with greater emphasis placed on maintaining minimum stability and preventing abrupt alignment shifts rather than on achieving decisive military outcomes. Advisors thus became custodians of continuity, tasked with sustaining functional command structures and preserving channels of influence, even as broader strategic ambition narrowed. Western intelligence assessments during this period noted a corresponding change in advisor behavior, observing that Soviet personnel increasingly emphasized consultation, mediation, and institutional maintenance rather than direct operational direction, reflecting an adaptation to reduced authority and heightened sensitivity to local autonomy. This adaptation did not eliminate influence, but it transformed its character, making it more diffuse and less immediately visible, yet still consequential in shaping how client militaries behaved under pressure. The advisory system's durability lay in its embeddedness, as decades of training, doctrine, and organizational alignment had created military institutions that continued to operate within Soviet-derived frameworks even as advisor authority waned, ensuring that influence persisted beyond the peak of direct involvement. This legacy effect underscored the strategic value of advisory missions, as they reshaped not only immediate outcomes but long-term institutional behavior. However, the same embeddedness also limited flexibility, as client militaries structured around Soviet models struggled to adapt to changing strategic and economic conditions, exposing the indirect costs of prolonged external guidance. Soviet planners increasingly understood that advisory control created dependencies that were difficult to unwind cleanly, binding Moscow to partners whose trajectories it could influence but not fully determine. As systemic pressures mounted toward the end of the Cold War, the advisory system remained active but increasingly cautious, reflecting a broader Soviet shift toward risk avoidance and disengagement from commitments that could not be sustained indefinitely. Advisors continued to provide Moscow with information, access, and leverage, yet their role was now framed within a strategy of managing decline rather than extending reach. This final phase revealed the fundamental trade-off inherent in the use of advisors as de facto commanders, which was that indirect control offered flexibility and deniability, but also limited accountability and ultimate authority, making outcomes contingent on local actors whose interests could diverge despite external influence. The persistence of advisory missions until the end of the Cold War demonstrated their perceived utility, as Moscow preferred embedded influence to abrupt withdrawal. Yet the narrowing scope of their impact reflected the constraints of indirect power in a changing international system. In retrospect, the Soviet use of military advisors as de facto commanders stands as a defining example of Cold War power projection, conducted through institutions rather than occupation, shaping conflicts and regimes through guidance, dependency, and embedded authority while preserving the outward form of sovereignty. The Tyukin system's endurance across decades underscores how influence can be exercised quietly and continuously without formal command. But its eventual limits illustrate that indirect control cannot substitute indefinitely for political legitimacy or economic strength, a reality that became increasingly apparent as the Cold War drew to a close and the structures sustaining Soviet influence began to erode from within. In the final assessment of the Soviet use of military advisors as de facto commanders in client states, the Cold War record reveals a system designed not for formal control, but for sustained influence under conditions where overt command would have been politically costly, strategically risky, or diplomatically untenable. And this system functioned by embedding Soviet authority within foreign military institutions, rather than asserting it openly. From its early post-war origins through its mature application across Asia, the Middle East, and parts of the socialist periphery, advisory missions allowed Moscow to project power by shaping how wars were planned, how forces were organized, and how decisions were made, while preserving the outward appearance of national sovereignty in client states. Advisors operated at the intersection of dependence and legitimacy, leveraging control over weapons, training, logistics, and doctrine to guide outcomes without issuing formal orders, creating a mode of influence that was difficult to attribute and harder to counter. The effectiveness of this model lay in its flexibility, as advisors could accelerate or restrain operations, mediate internal disputes, and adjust levels of involvement in response to shifting political and strategic conditions, all without crossing thresholds that would trigger direct confrontation with rival powers. Over time, the advisory system became institutionalized, embedding Soviet operational culture within client militaries and generating long-term alignment that persisted even as direct authority fluctuated. Yet this same embeddedness revealed the limits of indirect command, as advisors could shape behavior but not guarantee political cohesion, economic viability, or regime legitimacy, making outcomes contingent on local conditions beyond Moscow's full control. By the late Cold War, advisory missions had evolved from tools of confident expansion into mechanisms for managing risk and preserving influence amid constraint, reflecting a broader recalibration of Soviet power projection. The persistence of advisors until the end of the Cold War demonstrates how central this method had become to Soviet strategy, as Moscow consistently preferred embedded authority to overt intervention, even as its capacity to sustain influence diminished. In retrospect, the Soviet use of military advisors as de facto commanders illustrates a distinctive form of Cold War competition, one conducted through institutions, dependencies, and daily decision-making, rather than through formal occupation or direct command. It shows how power can be exercised quietly and continuously, shaping conflicts and regimes without assuming explicit responsibility, and how advisory presence can function as a strategic instrument precisely because it blurs the line between assistance and control. At the same time, the eventual erosion of this system underscores the inherent limits of indirect authority, as influence embedded in foreign institutions remains vulnerable to political change, economic decline, and shifting legitimacy. The Soviet experience thus demonstrates both the strength and fragility of advisory power, revealing how it can extend reach while masking control, yet ultimately depends on conditions that cannot be fully engineered or enforced from the outside. As the Cold War ended, the advisory model stood as a testament to a strategy that maximized influence while minimizing exposure, shaping decades of conflict through guidance rather than command, and leaving behind a legacy of institutional alignment that outlasted the presence of Soviet officers themselves, but could not survive the collapse of the system that sustained them.